Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessin. This is Colorado State of Mind. This week in the countdown to November 6th, the major development is early and absentee voting, which is underway in half a dozen or more states. Colorado is not one of those yet, but we'll note the deadline to register to vote in the 2012 election is not far away. It's Tuesday, October 9th. This week we also saw a nationwide in-person effort to register more voters, and that continues round the clock at govotecolorado.com, the official state website to register to vote or verify that you are registered. Here on Colorado State of Mind, we're focusing our election discussions on the next congressional delegation, and we continue this week with District 2 in the northwest part of Denver. Congressman Jared Polis, a Democrat from Boulder, is the incumbent who has represented the district for 4 years. He focused on education while he's been in Washington, including the sponsorship of the Race to the Top Act of 2011. He's here tonight, along with his Republican challenger, who is State Senator Kevin Lundberg of Berthoud. He has been a lawmaker in both the Colorado Senate and the House for the past 10 years. There are two other candidates in this race, Libertarian Randy Llewellyn and from the Green Party, Susan Hall. At the end of this half hour, we'll show you part of my interviews with each of them. Let's look again at the congressional map so that you can spot District 2 boundaries. This is in pink on the map. This is the way it has been for the past decade, including voters in Thornton and Boulder and west to Vail and Grand Lake. This election, District 2, has grown to include more of Jefferson County as well as all of Larimer. By registration, there is a three-way split, not entirely even, but three groups of Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated voters. So now, let's talk to Congressman Jared Polis and Senator Kevin Lundberg. As the two of you look at this sitting Congress, which has been called in many places the least productive, the most partisan Congress, a lot of things that were left undone when you went on election recess last week. How do you regard this, Senator Lundberg? When you look at this Congress, what do you expect from them in that lame duck session up until the end of the year and then after January?
Well, it'll all be decided on November 6th with the election really as to what direction the nation will go, and that's up to the people. I've always said that most of the votes are really determined on election day. So, you know, my counsel and advice to everybody is you need to vote. If you want to see your ideas promoted in Congress, be they on the left or the right. I would hope that the lame duck session will look at those realities as well, because really we need to move forward, we need to make progress, we need to create an economic environment where jobs can be produced, where people can get on with living their lives rather than this really economic malaise we've seen for the last several years.
Congressman, you will be the one going back for that lame duck session. What do you expect? Will that Congress keep us from going over this fiscal cliff that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Rocky Mountain PBS, for holding this forum and helping to show voters across the state the different alternatives this election. And I agree with my opponent, Senator Lundberg, that the election is important, and I hope everybody who watches this, wherever they live, vote in all the races on the ballot. Look, this has been the least productive Congress in some time. I'm certainly among the 85% of Americans who strongly disapprove of this Congress, the way it's been run by Eric Cantor and John Boehner, voting repeatedly, for instance, over 30 times to repeal health care reform rather than try to make it work better for our country, returning to a system that we know failed, led to 10 to 15% increased costs year after year, rather than moving forward on figuring out how to create jobs, grow our economy, create a stable business climate, balance our budget. All of these issues, time and time again, have been kicked down the road. Now, we have a unique opportunity in November and December to restore fiscal stability, to balance our budget with a balanced approach, and I really hope that Congress rises to that occasion. Now, it will be the lame duck Congress, regardless of the outcome of the presidential race or congressional races. It will be the current Congress and the current president that sit in November and December. Now, yes, one party or the other will have wind in their sails, depending on the outcome of the election, but we have some serious issues to deal with. Absent congressional action, there'll be enormous middle-class tax increases that'll hit American families hard. And both Democrats and Republicans agree we need to keep those middle-class tax cuts and make sure that in the middle of a recession, taxes for middle-class families don't go up by over $1,500.
Senator, as you have been out there talking to the constituents who you hope will vote for you, are they telling you that they agree with this gridlock in Congress, that the Republicans, that John Boehner and Eric Cantor should be holding the line as they are?
Well, if you want to talk about gridlock in Congress, it's the U.S. Senate with Harry Reid, who has yet to even pass a budget in the last 3 years, 3+ years. So everybody understands that there is a real clash of ideas there. But what I hear people saying is not a concern over Congress, but a concern over their jobs, a concern over the fact that over the last 4 years, incomes have slipped, that costs have gone up, that gas is more than $2 a gallon more than it was 4 years ago. Issues like that are the issues that people have overwhelmingly talked to me about, and that's what needs to happen. The lame duck session is the first step, but the real work will begin next January when we have a new team in town ready to tackle the bills, and my whole intention is to stop the spending, to hold the line on taxes, to put people back to work with sound practices that put private business in charge, rather than more government programs and more government spending and more debt that we cannot afford.
Let's talk about some of those jobs in District 2, which belong to the wind energy industry. And one of the things left undone before the Congress left was the wind energy production tax credit. I know this is something that you're in favor of.
Yeah, and I think most voters in Colorado, when they say, oh, Washington can't get along, it's really a pox on both your houses. There's plenty of blame to go around between Democratic and Republican leaders for not working together to move our country forward. The wind production tax credit is a perfect example. There is strong bipartisan support among our congressional delegation here in Colorado and nationally. We give enormous tax breaks to the oil and gas industry, over $40 billion cost the taxpayers over 10 years. Now, one approach, and I also support this, to rein in the budget deficit would be to give that industry no special tax loopholes or exemptions. But look, if we can't succeed in doing that, if we can't rein those in, let's make sure that the wind and solar industry get a tax advantage as well, so that they compete on a level playing field with oil and gas, and that government isn't picking the winners and losers and saying oil and gas, you're a winner, wind and solar, you're a loser. Great opportunity for job creation in Colorado, and if we can't repeal the loopholes for the oil and gas industry, I strongly support the production tax credit for wind and solar energy.
Senator, I believe you don't.
I don't support those special subsidies for wind energy, because I believe every energy source needs to compete on an even playing field. And I would also really challenge my opponent here as to all of the subsidies that are supposedly in place for oil and gas. There's a foreign investment tax credit system that's available across the board for all industries. There's the ability to expense the expenses out for the drilling process, which is a very expensive process, but there are no subsidies such as what wind is receiving today. And so if we want a even playing field, what really needs to happen is we need to say, no, we're not going to give an extra 2.2 cents per kilowatt to the wind energy. Let's let all of the energy sources compete on an even playing field. Back in the 70s, we went through this back then, where we had tax credits at the federal level, at the state level, for renewable energy solutions. But unfortunately, when we subsidized those solutions, they were only economically viable when those subsidies existed. If we will simply let the industries go in a free market mechanism, we'll find the very best come to the top, and the systems that aren't quite ready to play economically won't be put out and pumped up and then drop flat when the subsidies go away. And that's the problem we've got with wind right now.
I think that's a philosophy that led to Blue Water Horizon in the Gulf. That's a philosophy that leads to a reliance on foreign oil that makes us less secure as a nation. Look, we need a comprehensive national energy policy. It needs to be an all-of-the-above approach. And we need to do it right. Our district here in Colorado and other parts of Colorado are, for instance, the sites of extraction for natural gas. Now, natural gas has tremendous opportunity to reduce our carbon emissions, to help secure a domestic source of energy. We also need to make sure that we do it in the right way, that hydraulic fracturing doesn't upset communities, that it doesn't occur too close to schools and housing subdevelopments, and it's done in a safe way that doesn't pollute our air or water. We can do it, and we need to do it. Look, energy is incredibly important. And I think we need a thoughtful, all-of-the-above approach that doesn't give any special preference to oil and gas. Enormous tax advantages for the oil and gas industry. In addition, all of the hidden subsidies. What about the cost of national defense? What about the cost of the Iraq war, largely an oil war? What about the cost of pollution of the air and the water that are economic externalities that are not even accounted for in how we price carbon and how we price fossil fuels? Of course, fossil fuels are going to be a critical part of energy for decades to come, but we need to have a plan to transition to renewable energy, and we need to start now.
Let me follow up on that a little bit, if I might, because this discussion of all of these special tax advantages for oil and gas, they don't exist. There's a very small amount that is put in for research and development, but there are no subsidies like what wind has. And I'm not opposed to renewable energy. My own home is run on solar and wind. I designed that back in the 90s, long before I was in the legislature, when it just seemed like a good idea for me, but it wasn't cost effective. It was a very fascinating technology that I believe will play a larger role in coming decades. But we've got to stick with the economic realities of what we have. And the energy needs we have, yes, we need energy independence, but we're not going to do that by constantly choking off the domestic production by, refusing to put the Keystone Pipeline in place, by shutting down through the permitting process much of the drilling in the Gulf. What I see in the current administration is a push to restrict our domestic production. Hence, we have to go outside. We need all of the above starting here, not starting out there.
Just one more quick point on that. The Congressional Budget Office, which scores bills, as Senator Lundberg knows, we have a similar entity here in the state that comes up with the cost of bills. So they have scored $40 billion in savings from eliminating oil and gas loopholes. So it's a very real number. I'm the co-sponsor of a bill to replace the medical device tax in the Affordable Care Act. Instead of paying for health care reform with increasing taxes on medical devices, which would only increase health care costs, we replace that with simply eliminating the loopholes for the oil and gas industry. It also reduces the deficit by several $1 billion.
I'd have one question. What are those actual tax subsidies? Can you cite the specific subsidy that's amounting to that $40 billion?
Absolutely. They're all in my bill. You even talked about some of them. It's the accounting for depreciation that is special in particular to that industry, for use of wells and how fast that they can be depleted and how that's accounted for. There's no other industry that benefits from these provisions. And you can say any industry can benefit from them, but what other industry can benefit from a provision in tax code that says this is, you depreciate how fast your well is used? That's specifically an oil and gas provision.
Rates exist for every industry, and they're necessary because those are the real costs of the production.
And what I'm saying is let the oil and gas industry depreciate their capital investments like every other industry in America, like a printing press, like a machine that manufactures cars. Why give them special treatment and let government pick winners and losers?
Well, if you're familiar with the IRS tax code, every industry has a little bit different, if it's commercial property, or if it's a railroad, or if it's a computer.
Well, oil and gas has a lot different, and it's because the lobbyists have been very effective in manipulating Congress to give them tens of billions of dollars to the detriment of every other industry.
I think we're going to agree to disagree as to who's actually getting the subsidy,
that
wind or oil.
Gives me a segue, because obviously we could talk about energy, and it's important to Colorado. We could do it for the whole program, but I want to ask a couple of more things here before we go. Another big thing on the minds of voters is financial reform, avoiding the kind of thing that happened in 2008 that led us into this recession and into the problem that we've got with jobs and so forth. There was legislation passed in 2010, Dodd-Frank, which is supposed to help reform Wall Street, but Wall Street and its lawyers and its congressional representatives have managed to delay much of that action. So far we don't have reform. What are you going to do about that? Let's start with you, Senator.
Yeah, let me dive into that one if I could, because when I talk to the individual business owner trying to get a loan today, it's so difficult for that to occur today. And when I talk to the bankers, they're like, Dodd-Frank has changed the rules in such a way that we're not sure what direction to go. This is a typical example of where Congress thinks they're going to fix something by putting up a 1,000-plus page bill that will take years and years to sort out. And what we've ended up with, it may have had good intentions, but its actual result has been to choke off financial services for businesses that need it. We need some significant reform in Dodd-Frank. And, you know, it wasn't just your assumption of your question was that Wall Street has obviously created this bubble. It was Barney Frank and company back in the 90s who set up an unrealistic system on how mortgages were to be approved and let out that created this bubble that did burst. And we have a problem that needs to be fixed, but the problem was caused by Congress as much as anyone else.
All right, there you are. You're in Congress. What's your view of whether Dodd-Frank is going to give us meaningful reform?
Well, I think financial regulatory reform was a good first step. We created a Consumer Financial Protection Agency. It's now up and running, protecting consumers from financial abuse. Obviously, there's ways we can build upon and improve upon it. Frankly, I think we went too far with regard to regulating small and mid-sized entities and not far enough with regard to breaking up entities that are too large to fail. Now, we did create a mechanism for preventing entities from becoming too large to fail, but I would like to see antitrust exercised more vigorously. I'd also like to make sure that we don't add paperwork and costs and legal compliance to entities that are simply too small to create any kind of systemic risk. Another positive step is bringing derivative transactions onto exchanges. That occurred under Dodd-Frank, as well as making sure that speculation is looked at in a different way than the use of hedging to reduce risk, for instance, an airline simply hedging their fuel costs. So again, I think it's a step in the right direction. We need to fine-tune it rather than repeal it. We can't allow another banking meltdown like the one in 2009 that led to this Great Recession.
And has Congress revised its thinking on how many mortgages, how many people should take on a mortgage in this country?
Again, you know, I think one thing I agree with Senator Lundberg on is credit has become too tight for small businesses. Now, I don't see that as a function of regulation. It's a function of the marketplace. We went from a place in 2008, 2007 when credit was too easy. People that shouldn't have had credit to buy their home for their business were able to get it. The risk was sent off to Wall Street, repackaged as in securities and sell to other people. One of the things we did in Wall Street regulatory reform is require the issuing bank to retain part of the mortgage. They can't just immediately issue the mortgage and send 100% of the risk off to Wall Street, somebody who doesn't know your house, doesn't know your neighborhood, doesn't know the condition of the economy. They have to retain part of that risk with the issuing bank. Look, we need to make credit easier, but we can't go back to how easy credit was in 2000 and 2007, 2008. It'll lead to another bubble. It's a natural pendulum. It swings over time, and I support many of the policy levers that will help bring it back to the center, including a capital gains tax exemption for community banks to recapitalize, raise equity capital, the most powerful and leverageable form of capital to get them lending again, as well as raising the limits on what credit unions are able to lend to small businesses.
We find some common ground here on we need to reform the federal legislation, and that credit was too available to people who couldn't afford it back in the 90s. But I do disagree as to how that occurred. It was through federal legislation that required. I remember talking to a friend of mine who ran a mortgage banking company here in Denver, and he was telling me back then, it's crazy. The systems they put in place, we are virtually required to provide loans to people we know can't pay it back. So the federal government comes in and creates that kind of a system. Now the federal government comes in with Dodd-Frank and creates a system that chokes everything off. I don't believe the solution is, well, I guess Congress can get it right the third time. No, more often than not, I mean, I'm not calling for repeal, but I am calling for a dramatic reform, but not so that we can get in from the federal level and try to manipulate it a third way. Let's figure out ways to back off the federal controls. Let states, as a state legislator, I understand how much the federal government gets in our way. Let states have more authority and prerogative in many of these areas, and show a little more faith and trust into the individual bankers, the community banks. Dodd-Frank shutting them off. We need to, and we have an agreement here, I believe, that we need to encourage the smaller banks to be able to live, but it's not through more regulation, it's through less.
Yeah, community banks, credit unions are part of the solution, not the problem.
That's
right.
Good. That's nice to hear where there's some intersection here. Right? Very good. Here's something else I know you both think is important, education. You've worked on it at the state level. You've worked on some federal legislation. Mm-hmm. Is education going to get the funding that it needs to provide this future solution for this job force that we have coming up?
Well, let's take that issue of funding. Funding is a necessary component, but it's only one piece of the pie. When I talk to educators, far too many of them are complaining about not the federal funds, but the federal controls. And as a state legislator, again, we suffer under all of the federal requirements and mandates and systems. Federal funding provides about 7%, I believe it is, for most of our public schools here in Colorado. And yet, if you look at the rules and the regulations, it's about 100% that comes from the federal level. I'm calling for getting the federal government out of the education business, putting it back in the hands of the states, you know, an example that I think is a very good example are charter schools. Those have really blossomed, but it's not because they have more funding. Indeed, they have less funding because of the formulas that are put together. It's the fact that they're accountable to individual parents, indeed sometimes set up by the parents themselves, that makes them better. That's what we need to focus on and promote rather than just more dollars.
Let me get a comment from you before we go to closing statements.
Well, I'd love to talk about education forever. I started a charter school before I was in Congress and served as superintendent. And Senator Lundberg and I agree on many of the state issues around education, certainly not all of them, but certainly choice and homeschooling and charter schools. However, I see a federal role that is constructive. For instance, through Race to the Top, we were able to encourage states to remove the caps on the number of charter schools, to set up independent chartering agencies, to provide funding equity for charter schools and choice. The federal government is an important catalyst. We are a nation, after all, a composition of 50 states, several territories, many school districts, thousands of school districts, but we succeed and fail together. And I think it's critical that we have a national strategy around making sure that Americans, whether they're born in Alabama, Colorado, or California, are ready to compete for 21st century jobs to make our country strong.
Well, we've come to the time where I want each of you to take a minute here at the end to say whatever you would like to say in this election and to the voters. I'm going to let you start because we just heard from Congressman Polis. Senator, what is your statement?
Well, first, I want to thank you for this time to be able to interact on some of the ideas that really are important to every citizen in Colorado. And it's an important decision that they have in the 2nd Congressional District because we have a clear choice between the two of us in many ways. First and foremost, I would urge people to go to our websites. Mine is lundberg2012.com and check it out. You can see my legislative record there. You can see my stand on issues. You can see what I'm all about and how I'll represent their interests in Congress. And here's the primary point. The question is, how much of Washington should be in charge of our lives, or how much of that should be in our hands and at the state level? I will not raise taxes. I will not increase regulations. I will do my best to put freedom back on the pedestal rather than federal control and federal systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Congressman, last statement.
I'm Jared Polis, running for Congress from the 2nd Congressional District. My website is polisforcongress.com. I've created hundreds of jobs in the private sector. I've served on the State Board of Education, started 2 charter schools, served as superintendent of 1. I want to go to Washington and help make sure that we can move education forward, have a federal strategy that improves schools across the country, make sure that this meet the learning needs of all kids. I support balancing the budget and a balanced budget amendment, as well as making sure that the wealthiest Americans don't pay a lower tax rate than middle-class families. We need a fair and balanced approach to balancing the budget, to restoring our fiscal integrity, and to making sure that we have the stability and the tax code to keep America competitive in the increasingly global economy in the 21st century. I'm Jared Polis, and I'd be honored to have your vote.
All right, there you have it. The incumbent Democrat, the Republican who is running, they are both running for the seat in District 2. And as we said earlier, Susan Hall is running on the Green Party ticket, and also Randy Llewellyn is the Libertarian candidate. They too came to the studio this week. Both of them are looking at what government spends and what it takes in. Hall, for instance, shares the view of Democrats about taxing the wealthy.
I think that it's time that the people who have made so much money in this country begin to repay that.
There is much ahead for the President and the Congress. What's your view of the gridlock that we have seen in Congress? And if you were elected, do you see yourself lining up with Republicans or Democrats more often?
I hope there will be some more Green Party members elected, and I will certainly align with them. And I think I could align with the progressives in the Democrat side. I think Barbara Lee from California was the only Republican that stood up against the Iraq War. And so I have great respect for her that she could stand alone and see. Certainly I don't believe in those wars anyway.
43% of everything the federal government spends is borrowed or made up. And we borrow it from places like China and the banking industry. We're in tremendous debt. So what I'm proposing, I think what Gary Johnson's proposing, is that we reduce the size of our government. We bring all our troops home and use it for defense only, just as per the Constitution. We could have the best defense in the world, but we don't have to have preeminent strikes. We don't have to be the police force of the world, and that's not our job.
You can see the longer interviews with the Libertarian and Green Party candidates, and you can see this discussion again with Congressman Jared Polis and State Senator Kevin Lundberg by looking us up at video.rmpbs.org. Next week, all of Colorado and the nation will be watching the big event at the University of Denver, the first debate between President Barack Obama and Governor Mitt Romney. You'll see that here live on Wednesday night, and then on this program next Friday, we'll talk about the history being made, and we'll get debate reaction from Dick Lamb, Hank Brown, Gail Shetler, Jane Norton, and historian Patricia Limerick. Thanks for watching Colorado State of Mind this week. I'm Cynthia Hessin. Good night. Obviously, the top of the ticket is always important in a presidential election year. Do you feel like you're right in stride with Mitt Romney?
Yes, particularly when he chose his running mate, Paul Ryan. I had the privilege of speaking with him recently and watching him speak and hearing the specifics, and it's 100% with where I'm headed.